Welcome to 6 Feet of History. This one hits home for me a little more than some of the other history I cover. My grandfather was an artilleryman with the 1st Marine Division during World War II, including on Guadalcanal. And from everything I know, he worked with the 105mm howitzer. So I've always had a little bit of fascination with artillery and the crews who operated it. And standing here on top of Kennesaw Mountain looking at these cannons, there was always one question that immediately came to mind. If you've ever hiked to the top of Kennesaw Mountain and seen these cannons sitting there, you've probably had the same thought. How in the hell did they get these things up here? I actually was taking pictures of the cannons when I started talking to another guy nearby, and I told him, dude, it's still crazy to think that they got these things all the way up here. And that's when he laughed and said, yeah, I think about that every time I see them. And it stuck with me, because I think that's exactly what most of us do. We get to the top, we see these beautiful old cannons sitting quietly among the trees, and we think for a second about what an absolute nightmare it would have been to get these cannons up here. Well, we don't have to wonder anymore. It's time to know. The cannons sitting here today mark the position occupied by Captain Charles L. Lumsden's Alabama Battery during the Atlanta campaign in June of 1864. The type of cannon associated with this position was primarily the Model 1857 12-pounder Napoleon, one of the most widely used cannons of the Civil War. And when I say 12-pounder, I'm not talking about the weight of the cannon. That refers roughly to the weight of the solid projectile it could fire. The brass cannon tube itself weighed more than 1,200 pounds. Put that tube onto its wooden carriage and you're dealing with well over a ton. And that has somehow got to make its way up to Kennesaw Mountain. Not up to, but all the way to the top of. And that's just the cannon. A working artillery battery also needed ammunition, limbers, caissons, tools, equipment, horses, and men needed to operate and support all of it. The Model 1857 Napoleon had a 4.62-inch bore, so just under 5 inches across. It was a smoothbore cannon capable of firing several types of ammunition, including solid shot, explosive shell, spherical cases, and canister. At close range, canister transformed the Napoleon into something horrifyingly effective. Instead of sending one projectile downrange, it sent spread of smaller iron balls outward from the muzzle. So these things may look absolutely beautiful sitting here in the woods today, but they were built to be devastating battlefield weapons. And now we get to the question everybody asks. How did they get these artillery cannons up here? Well, Kennesaw Mountain was so steep that Confederate engineers initially advised against putting artillery on the crest at all. The terrain simply wasn't considered practical for moving cannons. But Confederate artillery officers wanted that elevation, so they made it practical. A roadway was cut through the brush along the mountain. Ropes were attached to the artillery, and manpower was used to haul these cannons uphill. According to the National Park Service's research, one of the cannons brought into the mountain positions required approximately 100 men pulling on ropes, and they managed to get that one cannon to the top in about 30 minutes. Think about that the next time you hike this mountain. You reach the top sweating and breathing hard, and then you realize that men came up this terrain while collectively hauling more than a ton of artillery behind them, and then they had to bring up everything necessary to actually use it. Once Lumsden's Napoleons were positioned near the crest of Big Kennesaw, his men dug in and began firing on Federal positions. From this elevation, they had an incredible view of the surrounding battlefield, but that advantage came with a serious problem. Once the Union artillery figured out where the Confederate cannons were located, the mountain wasn't exactly going anywhere. Lumsden's Napoleons were smoothbores, while some of the Federal artillery opposing them consisted of rifled cannons capable of greater range and accuracy. Robert James Maxwell, who actually served in Lumsden's battery, later wrote about Federal artillery methodically ranging in on their positions. One Confederate artillery named Blackstock was killed. Another man, Horace Martin, had part of his ear clipped by shell fragment. At one point, Lieutenant Hargrove went onto the exposed summit with field glasses to observe the Federal position. A Federal cannon fired at him. The projectile struck the ground in front of him, ricocheted off the mountainside, and went tumbling over his head. Just imagine that for a second. Look out across the peaceful landscape today and imagine seeing a distant flash from an enemy cannon. Then you're waiting. Somewhere out there, an artillery projectile is already on its way toward exactly where you're standing. Eventually, the position on Big Kennesaw became too vulnerable, and Lumsden's battery was moved south towards Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill before the major Union assault of June 27th. This is an important detail. The cannons here represent Lumsden's earlier position on Big Kennesaw, but his battery fought the main June 27th assault from further south, and Lumsden's men weren't finished. From their new position, the 4 Confederate cannons became involved in an artillery exchange in which approximately 24 Federal cannons answered 4 Confederate cannons. During that exchange, a Federal shell came directly through an embrasure at Lumsden's cannon number 3, killing an artilleryman named Gurley, and continued into an ammunition behind the position, causing explosions among the battery's ammunition. Then, during the fighting on June 27th, Federal infantry eventually came close enough that Lumsden's men switched to canister. Maxwell later remembered the battery sweeping the ground in front of them with canister and preventing Federal troops immediately in their front from getting much closer than roughly 150 yards. That's what makes standing here today almost eerie. Listen to it. Birds, wind, in the trees, people talking quietly as they hike past. Maybe somebody stops and takes pictures of one of these beautiful cannons. And 160 years ago, this same mountainside was filled with men hauling artillery up its slopes with ropes, digging earthworks, loading ammunition, watching the valley for flashes from Federal cannons, and listening for incoming artillery. That's the strange thing about the battlefields, is that eventually they become quiet again. So if you've ever hiked to the top of Kennesaw Mountain and see these cannons, stop for a second and look at them. Because that question that seems to occur to just about everybody who comes to the top, how did they get these things up here, actually has an answer. They cut a path through the mountain, they attached ropes, they gathered the manpower, and they pulled 6 feet of history.